I received an invitation in the mail a few days ago. An ornate card, its edges trimmed with gold, announcing a Halloween party at a grand mansion on the outskirts of town. I had lived here for years and never noticed a mansion out that way, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to go. The night of the party, I drove down a winding road through dense woods. My headlights flickered as I approached, revealing an enormous, ivy-covered house far grander than anything I'd imagined. Its towering spires and darkened windows seemed to watch me as I parked, my car the only one in sight. There was something off about the place, but I shook the feeling, convincing myself it was just the atmosphere. The front doors creaked open as I walked up the steps, seemingly on their own. I hesitated, but then stepped inside, greeted by the sound of soft, melodic music and murmured conversation. The entry hall was breathtaking. Gilded mirrors, velvet drapes, and chandeliers dripping with crystal. The air was thick with perfume and something else I couldn't place, something faintly metallic. Everywhere I looked, people milled about in the most extravagant costumes I had ever seen. Ball gowns spun with intricate lace, men in Victorian suits, and even masks adorned with feathers and jewels. For a moment, I felt underdressed in my simple costume, but no one seemed to care. In fact, no one really looked at me at all. I wandered through the rooms, marveling at the decor. It was all so perfect, as if frozen in time. A butler offered me a drink, and I took a sip, surprised by how bitter it tasted. I placed the glass on a tray and moved further into the house, feeling an odd chill as I did. The deeper I went, the less lively the guests seemed. Conversations were muted, movements sluggish, and I noticed that no one seemed to laugh. Their smiles were wide, but their eyes were hollow. It wasn't until I reached the ballroom that the strangeness truly hit me. The dancers moved in slow, deliberate circles, their feet never seeming to touch the ground. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me. But when I looked closer, I saw the truth. Their feet were inches above the floor, gliding silently through the air. I backed away, my heart thudding in my chest. That's when I noticed it. None of the guests had shadows. I stumbled backward, suddenly desperate to leave, but as I turned, I collided with a tall figure. His face was hidden behind a porcelain mask, but I could feel his eyes boring into me from behind it. He didn't speak, just stared, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I'm leaving, I muttered, pushing past him. But as I turned to head for the door, the crowd seemed to thicken. Bodies pressed in on me from all sides, faces too pale, too still. And then I saw it, blood trickling from beneath one of the dancers' masks. A slow, steady stream that dripped onto the floor, pooling at her feet. I gasped, but no one else seemed to notice. They just kept dancing, oblivious to the growing stain of red on the floor. I tried to run, but it felt like the room was expanding, the doors stretching further and further away. Panic clawed at my throat as the chandeliers overhead began to sway, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the walls. The music grew louder, almost frantic, and the guests' movements became jerky, unnatural, as if they were being controlled by invisible strings. That's when I realized this wasn't just a party. This was a trap. I spun around, trying to find the way I came in, but the hallways twisted, unfamiliar now. The house was changing, shifting as if it were alive. My pulse raced and I ran, my footsteps echoing in the silent halls. I turned a corner and froze. Standing in the center of the hallway was a woman in a blood-soaked gown. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes dark hollows, and when she smiled, her teeth were jagged, yellowed. She raised a hand, pointing directly at me. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered. And then the walls began to bleed. The house groaned, and I felt the floor shift beneath me. My skin prickled with terror as I turned to flee. But before I could move, I felt something icy grip my ankle. I looked down, horrified, as a hand, pale, skeletal, was clawing its way out of the floor, dragging me down with it. I screamed, but the music swallowed the sound. I don't know how I broke free, but the next thing I remember was running, sprinting, through the halls, my heart pounding in my ears. The icy grip on my ankle still lingered like a phantom touch. Every corner I turned seemed to lead me deeper into the house, as if it had no end, no escape. The walls pulsed with a life of their own, and with every step I took, they seemed to close in on me. I passed a large mirror on one of the walls and stopped. Something about it made me hesitate. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. My reflection was there, but it was wrong, faint, almost translucent, like I was fading. Behind me, I could see the ballroom, but there were no guests now. Just an empty room, silent except for the lingering echo of the music. Then I saw her again, the woman in the blood-soaked gown. This time she was standing directly behind me, her hand hovering near my shoulder. Her reflection smiled, but her eyes remained hollow pits of darkness. My blood turned cold. I spun around ready to face her, but there was nothing behind me. The hall was empty. I backed away from the mirror, heart hammering, but as I did, I felt something shift under my feet. The floorboards creaked, and I looked down to see dark red stains slowly spreading beneath them. Blood. It was seeping up through the cracks like the house itself was bleeding. I turned and ran again, but now every step felt heavier, like I was wading through thick air. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the further I went, the more I noticed something horrific. There were figures trapped in the walls. Faces pressed against the wallpaper, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with terror. Their hands clawed at the fabric as if they were trying to break free, but they were trapped. Frozen. Their agony was palpable, radiating from the very structure of the house. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out, but as I turned another corner, I saw them, the guests. They were back, but different now. Their costumes were torn, revealing raw, decayed flesh underneath. Their eyes were black voids, hollow and empty. They didn't move, just stood there, watching me with those dark, vacant stares. I backed away slowly, trying to put as much distance between me and them as possible. That's when I saw the door, an exit at the end of the hall. My heart surged with hope. If I could just reach it, I could escape this nightmare. I ran toward it, but the hall seemed to stretch longer with every step. The door drifted further and further away, and the figures behind me began to move. Slowly at first, but then faster, their limbs jerking unnaturally like puppets on strings. The walls around me seemed to breathe, pulsing in time with the rapid beat of my heart. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the lights above flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows that danced across the ceiling. And then the door burst open. Standing there was a man, or what asterisk used asterisk to be a man. His face was pale, skin stretched tight over his skull, and his eyes were nothing but black hollows. He grinned, his lips splitting as though they hadn't moved in centuries. "Welcome back," he rasped, his voice dry and brittle like old paper. "You never should have left." He took a step forward, and I could see his body was covered in wounds, deep gashes, oozing blood that dripped onto the floor. Each step he took left a trail of red behind him. "No! No!" I screamed, backing away. I turned to run, but I was surrounded. The guests had closed in on me, their dead eyes watching with cold detachment. I was trapped. The man reached for me, his fingers gnarled and skeletal, and I braced for his touch. But before he could reach me, the house shook violently. The walls groaned, and the floor split open beneath me. I fell, tumbling into darkness. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me. When I opened my eyes, I was lying in a room I hadn't seen before. It was small, windowless, and stank of rot. In the center of the room was a large wooden chest, its surface covered in old, rusted chains. I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me, and approached the chest. There was something about it. Something asterisk calling asterisk to me. The chains rattled as I reached for the lid, and as my fingers brushed against the wood, I heard a voice, a whisper, faint and distant. "Don't open it." Asterisk, I froze, my hand hovering above the chest. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once, a soft plea that echoed in my mind. But I couldn't stop. I had asterisk to know what was inside. My hand moved on its own, gripping the edge of the chest, and with a creak, I began to lift the lid. The moment it opened, a wave of cold air rushed out, so cold it burned. I gasped and stumbled back as the lid flew open on its own, revealing what lay inside. The chest was filled with bones. Human bones, twisted and broken, covered in a thick black sludge that bubbled and hissed as if it were alive. But that wasn't the worst part. Among the bones was a face. Asterisk my face. Asterisk twisted, distorted, but unmistakably asterisk mine asterisk. I stared at it, frozen in horror, unable to move as the realization hit me. I wasn't just a guest at this party. I was part of it. I stumbled back from the chest. The grotesque image of my own face burned into my mind. My breath came in shallow gasps as panic surged through me. The walls of the small room seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, closing in on me. The realization struck like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a party. It was a death trap, and I was already entangled in its web. I had to get out. I had to asterisk run asterisk. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted for the door, yanking it open and plunging back into the maze of hallways. The house felt different now, more oppressive, the walls twisting and distorting as I ran. Everything was wrong, the air smelled sour, and the lights flickered wildly, casting jagged, erratic shadows. I could hear footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to escape, to outrun whatever horror was pursuing me. But the more I ran, the more the house seemed to change. Hallways stretched impossibly long, doors vanished before my eyes, and every turn led me deeper into the heart of this nightmare. I burst through a door and found myself in a grand dining room. A long table stretched out before me, draped in a white cloth, set with silverware and candles that flickered with dim, sputtering flames. The guests were seated around it, their faces pallid and grotesque, their eyes hollow and glassy. They were still dressed in their elaborate costumes, but their skin had taken on a sickly, decayed pallor, sagging over their bones. The woman in the blood-soaked gown sat at the head of the table. She smiled at me, a slow, twisted grin that sent a wave of nausea through me. "You're just in time," she said, her voice a guttural rasp. "We've been waiting for you." I tried to back away, but my legs felt heavy, as if something were holding me in place. The guests turned their heads in unison, all eyes now fixed on me. There was something deeply unsettling in the way they moved, too smooth, too synchronized, like marionettes on invisible strings. A low, rumbling sound filled the room, and the candles flickered violently. I looked down at the table and felt my stomach churn. The plates weren't filled with food. They were piled with rotting flesh, chunks of raw, decomposing meat, some still crawling with maggots. The stench hit me all at once, and I gagged, stepping back. But the heavy, invisible force kept me rooted in place. Suddenly, the walls began to bleed again, dark red streaks running down in thick rivulets, pooling on the floor. The guests didn't react. They just kept staring, their dead eyes locked onto me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let them trap me like this. With every ounce of strength, I forced my legs to move, breaking free from whatever held me, and turned to run. But something cold wrapped around my wrist. I glanced down to see a skeletal hand, its bones exposed and rotting, gripping me tightly. "No!" I screamed, trying to wrench my arm free, but the grip tightened, pulling me back toward the table. The woman in the blood-stained gown stood, her dead eyes glinting with malicious glee. "You belong here," she whispered, her voice low and echoing through the room. "You always have." The skeletal hand pulled harder, dragging me closer to the table. I struggled, but it was no use. My strength was fading, my body felt weaker with every second. I was losing. Just as I was about to collapse, I heard a sharp asterisk crack asterisk from above. The chandelier hanging over the dining table swayed violently, its chains snapping one by one. In a sudden, deafening crash, it came plummeting down, shattering across the table and sending shards of crystal flying. The guests didn't flinch. Their hollow eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking as blood pooled around their feet. Taking advantage of the chaos, I tore my wrist free and bolted from the room. The walls groaned, shifting around me, but I didn't care. I just had to get out. I ran until my lungs burned, my vision blurring with panic and exhaustion. Finally, I found myself back in the entry hall, the grand staircase looming before me. The front doors were still open, just a crack, enough for me to see the night beyond. Hope surged in my chest. If I could make it to the doors, I could escape. I sprinted toward them, the sound of my footsteps echoing loudly in the vast hall. But just as I reached the doors, they slammed shut with a thunderous boom. I skidded to a stop, yanking at the handles, but they wouldn't budge. I was trapped. And then I heard it, a low, growling whisper like the voice I'd heard before. "Asterisk, you can't leave." Asterisk, I spun around, heart racing. The guests were back. They stood at the foot of the staircase, watching me with those same cold, hollow eyes. But now their faces were twisted, contorted with rage and hunger. The woman in the gown stepped forward, her once beautiful face now rotting, her eyes black pits of nothingness. "You were never meant to leave," she hissed. "This house, it's part of you now." The walls trembled, and the chandelier overhead flickered wildly. I could feel it. The house was asterisk alive asterisk, feeding off my fear, my terror. And then the final horror dawned on me. I wasn't just a guest here. I had been part of this party before. This wasn't my first time here. The memories came flooding back in a rush of terror. I had asterisk died asterisk here, 100 years ago at this very party. I was one of them. The blood on my hands, the pale face in the mirror. It had all been real. I had been trapped here for a century, reliving this nightmare over and over, every time the house reappeared. The truth hit me like a physical blow, and I collapsed to my knees, the weight of it too much to bear. The guests closed in, their dead eyes gleaming with triumph. I sat there on my knees, the weight of the terrifying truth pressing down on me. My mind raced, piecing together the horrors I had just remembered. I had died in this house. I was one of them asterisk. The thought twisted in my gut, but something deep inside me refused to accept it. I wasn't ready to give in. I wasn't ready to become part of this nightmare forever. Their asterisk had asterisk to be a way out. The guests, now closing in, their grotesque faces twisted with hunger, seemed sure of their victory. But as they advanced, something flickered in the back of my mind, a memory, a faint fleeting image of light. There had been an asterisk way out asterisk, a chance to escape the last time. I just hadn't found it in time. But now, I had a second chance. I stood up, determination flooding my veins. The guests paused, their expressions twisting in confusion. I wasn't supposed to resist. I was supposed to succumb to the terror, to let the house consume me, but I wasn't going to let that happen. Ignoring the whispers creeping into my ears, the mocking laughter echoing through the house, I sprinted toward the grand staircase. The guests moved faster now, their steps jerky and unnatural, closing in on me with alarming speed. But I didn't stop. As I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, the house began to shake, groaning as if it were angry, like it knew asterisk I was trying to defy it. The chandeliers above swayed violently, the walls oozed blood, and the air around me grew colder. But I pushed forward, driven by the one glimmer of hope that had lodged itself in my mind. At the top of the stairs, I spotted it. An old faded door at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. I had passed it before, but I hadn't noticed the faint light seeping from underneath it. Now that light seemed to call to me like a beacon. It was the way out. It had to be. The guests were right behind me, their footsteps growing louder, closer. I could feel their cold breath on the back of my neck, their skeletal hands reaching for me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. I threw myself at the door, my hands gripping the knob, but it wouldn't turn. The light flickered underneath, and I could hear faint voices on the other side. Familiar voices. They were asterisk, calling my name asterisk. I pounded on the door, desperate. "Let me out!" I screamed, my voice hoarse. For a moment, nothing happened. The house seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing, the guests closing the gap, their dead eyes filled with anticipation. But then, with a loud asterisk, click asterisk, the door unlocked. It swung open, and I was hit with a rush of warm air, a stark contrast to the suffocating cold of the house. I didn't hesitate. I ran through the doorway, slamming it behind me just as the first of the guests lunged toward me. I collapsed on the other side, gasping for breath. The warmth surrounded me, comforting, like sunlight after a long storm. I looked up, expecting to find myself outside in the night air, but what I saw took my breath away. I was standing in a sunlit field, bright and green, the sky above me a soft shade of blue. The oppressive, decaying house was gone. In its place was peace, the kind that fills you with the deepest sense of relief. I turned in slow circles, feeling the warmth on my skin, the breeze tugging at my clothes. I was free. The realization hit me like a wave. The house, its twisted halls, the blood-soaked guests, the torment, it was all behind me. I had escaped. I had broken the cycle. As I walked further into the field, I could hear the faint sound of laughter in the distance, soft and inviting. I followed it, my legs still weak from the terror I had just endured, but the sound guided me, filling me with hope. And there, beyond a small hill, I saw them, people. Real people. They waved at me, their faces full of warmth and joy. I had made it back to the world of the living. I smiled, the fear melting away from me, replaced by a sense of triumph I hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. But just before I reached them, I turned back to the direction I had come from. The house, the phantom house, was gone. Completely vanished, as if it had never existed at all. Except, I knew it would come back. It would return, perhaps a century from now, to lure in another unlucky soul. But this time I had escaped, and I carried the knowledge with me. I could warn others. I could prevent this nightmare from repeating itself. I took a deep breath, feeling the sun on my face, and walked toward the laughter, toward life. I had survived the phantom house, and I would never look back.